I never thought my own brother would be standing on my doorstep at 3 in the morning with 2 police officers by his side, screaming for the whole neighborhood to hear that I'm a damn kidnapper and a family wrecker. Especially since only 3 weeks ago he was literally on his knees begging me to take his 7-year-old son because he couldn't cope and was on the verge of a total mental breakdown. Now, as I sit in my living room watching Leo sleep on the sofa, I realize that this month has changed our lives forever. And what started as a simple act of family mercy has spiraled into a full-scale war where there are no winners and no easy way out. It all started exactly 3 weeks ago when my older brother Mark called me in tears, and it was the first time in 10 years I had heard this grown, usually overconfident man just choking on his own helplessness. His wife Lisa had walked out on him 6 months prior, leaving him alone with Leo, and Mark, who always believed that raising children was women's work, suddenly crashed into a reality where he had to not only earn a paycheck but also cook breakfast, wash school uniforms, and answer the endless questions of a little human who was also going through his own trauma. Mark worked as an architect at a big firm in Chicago, and his schedules were always insane, but Lisa used to handle everything behind the scenes, and now he was drowning in domestic chores and his own bitter resentment toward his ex-wife. He told me over the phone that if he didn't get a break for at least a few weeks, he was either going to lose his job or just snap and take his anger out on the kid, and I, being the loving sister with a stable remote job and a big house in the suburbs, of course said yes. I remember the moment they pulled up to my house. Mark looked like he hadn't slept in months, his eyes were bloodshot, and his clothes were wrinkled, while Leo sat in the back seat of the car clutching his old Spider-Man backpack and staring out the window with a vacant look that no 7-year-old should ever have. Mark didn't even bother to step inside the house. He just dumped Leo's suitcase on the driveway, gave his son an awkward, rushed hug while mumbling something like, "Be good. Aunt Sarah will take care of you," and drove off without looking back, leaving nothing but the smell of burnt rubber and a heavy, suffocating silence in the air. For the first few days, Leo acted like the perfect guest. He was so quiet that I sometimes forgot he was even in the house, and that honestly scared me more than if he had thrown a tantrum or trashed my living room. He ate everything I put in front of him, cleared his own plate, and spent hours in his room just staring at his tablet or drawing in a notebook, and whenever I tried to get him into a conversation, he answered in one-syllable words as if he were afraid that saying too much would result in him being sent away again. I knew the kid needed time to adjust, but the more I watched him, the more I noticed disturbing details. He would flinch at loud noises, he never asked for help even if he couldn't reach something on a high shelf, and he had a habit of hiding scraps of food under his bed as if he wasn't sure he would be fed again the next day. By the end of the first week, the ice finally started to melt when we decided to make homemade pizza together, and I saw his eyes light up for the first time when I let him slice the pepperoni and arrange the cheese exactly how he wanted. We started spending more time in the backyard, and I taught him how to take care of my roses, and he turned out to be a very thoughtful and careful boy who could talk for hours about the different kinds of bugs he found in the grass. However, the more he opened up to me, the less he wanted to deal with his father, and every time Mark called on FaceTime in the evening, Leo would find 100 excuses not to come to the phone or would just say a quick hi, and run back to his room. Mark didn't even notice this at first because he was too busy finally living his life again, going to bars with friends and staying late at the office, and his calls became shorter and more formal as the days went by. He sent me money for groceries, but he never once asked how Leo was sleeping, what was bothering him, or what he was dreaming about, and I started to feel a deep, simmering anger toward my brother for treating his own son like a burden he had successfully offloaded. I watched Leo bloom in an atmosphere of peace and attention. I saw how he started to laugh again, how his nightmares stopped, and how he began to call my house our home. And a nagging, anxious feeling took root inside me that going back to his old life would be a genuine disaster for this boy. 10 days flew by, and Leo started asking questions I didn't have the answers to, like why his dad always got so angry when he dropped something on the floor, or why their house always smelled like beer and silence, and I tried my best to defend Mark by making up excuses about stress and exhaustion. But I could tell Leo didn't believe me. He was too smart for his own good. One evening as we sat on the porch watching the fireflies, Leo suddenly took my hand. His palm was so small and warm, and in a tiny trembling voice he asked, "Sarah, can I stay here forever? Because here I don't feel like I'm in the way." That question hit me like a physical blow to the chest, because in that moment, I knew there was no going back. and what was supposed to be a short vacation had turned into the start of a long, ugly family drama that was only just beginning to explode. After Leo asked me if he could stay forever, I didn't know how to look him in the eye because the honesty in his voice was so heavy that it felt like it was crushing the air out of my lungs. I just hugged him and told him that we would figure it out, but that night I stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling and realizing that I was now part of a situation that didn't have a clean exit strategy. The second week of his stay began with a phone call from Mark that changed everything, not because of what he said, but because of how he sounded, which was completely detached and almost celebratory about his new freedom. He told me that he had finally started dating again, and had met a woman named Chloe who didn't have kids and didn't really want them, and he said this with such a light tone that I felt a physical wave of nausea hitting me. I tried to tell him that Leo was having a hard time and that he was asking questions about why his life at home was so different from his life here, but Mark just laughed it off and said that kids are resilient and that I was probably just spoiling him with too much attention. It was in that moment that I realized my brother didn't just need a break. He was actively trying to reinvent himself as a man who didn't have the baggage of a 7-year-old son, and it made my blood boil to think that I was the one facilitating this escape. The financial aspect of this also started to get weird because Mark began Venmoing me large sums of money, way more than what was needed for groceries or toys, as if he were trying to pay me a salary for being a surrogate parent so he wouldn't have to feel guilty. He sent $2,000 in one go with a note that just said, "For the trouble." And looking at that notification made me feel like I was selling my soul or participating in some kind of unofficial adoption transaction that no one had agreed to. I tried to use the money to make Leo's life as stable as possible, taking him to a local dentist because I found out Mark hadn't taken him in over 2 years, and the dentist told me Leo had 3 cavities that must have been causing him pain for months. When I told Mark about the dentist's bill, he didn't ask if Leo was okay or if he was scared during the procedure. He just asked why I was looking for problems where there weren't any, and told me to stop being so dramatic. This total lack of empathy from my own brother started to build a wall between us that I knew would never come down, and I began to document everything: the missed calls, the dismissive texts, and the things Leo would tell me during our quiet moments in the kitchen. Leo started to change during that second week, becoming more vocal about his life back in Chicago, and the stories he told were not about physical abuse, but about a level of emotional neglect that broke my heart into a million pieces. He told me about nights when Mark would come home late and just give him a bowl of dry cereal for dinner because he was too tired to cook, or how he would spend entire Saturdays sitting in front of the TV while Mark slept off a hangover in the other room. There were no metaphors for the way Leo described his loneliness. He just said things like, "The house was always dark," or "Dad doesn't like it when I make noise." And those simple, plain sentences were more haunting than any dramatic outburst could ever be. I started to realize that the quiet, perfect child I had welcomed into my home was actually a child who had been trained to be invisible, so as not to bother a father who was drowning in his own selfishness. I decided to involve our mother, thinking she might be able to talk some sense into Mark, but that was a huge mistake that only added more fuel to the fire because she immediately took Mark's side, saying that men handle divorce differently, and that I should be more supportive of my brother during his transition. She told me that I was overstepping my boundaries by taking Leo to the doctor without Mark's explicit permission, and that I was confusing the boy by providing a lifestyle that his father couldn't maintain on his own. This made me realize that the dysfunction in our family ran much deeper than I had ever admitted to myself, and I felt like I was the only person standing between Leo and a life of being a secondary character in his own father's story. By the middle of the second week, Leo had completely integrated into my routine, and it felt so natural that I sometimes forgot he wasn't my own child, which was a dangerous headspace to be in. We went to the park, we started a small herb garden in the kitchen, and he even started calling me Sarah Mom by accident once, before quickly correcting himself with a terrified look on his face as if he had broken a sacred rule. I told him it was okay that he could call me whatever he wanted, but that night I cried in the shower because I knew that in 2 weeks, I was supposed to give him back to a man who didn't even know his favorite color was green. I started looking into legal options, just browsing through articles about de facto custodianship and grandparent/relative rights. Not because I wanted to steal him, but because the thought of him going back to that dark, silent house in Chicago felt like a death sentence for the happy, curious boy he was becoming. The tension reached a boiling point when Mark called me on a Friday night, sounding drunk and agitated, and told me that he was planning to come pick Leo up a week earlier than planned because Chloe wanted to go on a trip and he thought it would be a good idea for Leo to meet her. He didn't ask if Leo was ready or if I was okay with it. He just stated it as a fact, and when I tried to protest, he told me to remember my place and reminded me that he was the one with the legal rights and I was just the babysitter. I hung up the phone with my hands shaking, looking at Leo who was sitting on the floor playing with Legos, completely unaware that his world was about to be turned upside down again. And I knew right then that I wasn't going to let him go without a fight. The confrontation happened much sooner than I expected, and it was uglier than anything I could have prepared for. It was Saturday morning, just 2 days after that drunken phone call, when I saw Mark's black SUV pull into my driveway. He didn't call ahead. He didn't ask if we were home. He just showed up. I was in the kitchen making pancakes with Leo, and the moment the boy saw the car through the window, his entire body went rigid. He didn't run to the door to greet his father. Instead, he stepped back, away from the window, and gripped the edge of the counter until his knuckles turned white. He looked at me with a level of pure, unadulterated terror that told me everything I needed to know about his life back in Chicago. Mark didn't come alone either. A woman I assumed was Chloe was sitting in the passenger seat, staring at her phone and looking like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Mark hopped out of the car, looking refreshed and wearing expensive new sunglasses, a sharp contrast to the broken man who had dropped Leo off 3 weeks ago. He walked into my house without knocking, his boots clattering loudly on the hardwood floors, and the first thing he said wasn't, "How is my son?" or "I missed you." It was, "Leo, get your stuff. We're leaving in 10 minutes because we have a brunch reservation in the city, and I don't want to hit traffic." I felt a surge of cold fury. I told Mark that he couldn't just barge in and demand the boy leave when we had specifically agreed on a full month, and that Leo wasn't even packed. Mark laughed, that dismissive, arrogant laugh that always made me feel like a child, and told me that plans change and that he was the parent, so his word was law. He walked toward Leo, intending to ruffle his hair, but Leo actually shrunk away from him, hiding behind my legs. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face shifted from smugness to a dark, simmering irritation. He looked at me as if I had personally poisoned his son's mind. He told Leo to stop being a little drama queen, and to go upstairs and grab his backpack right now. That was when it happened. Leo, usually so quiet and compliant, gripped my hand and yelled at the top of his lungs, "No, I'm not going. I want to live here with Sarah forever. I hate it at your house. It's loud and you're never there, and I want to stay here." The look on Mark's face was terrifying. He didn't look sad or concerned that his son was miserable. He looked humiliated. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing into slits, and he pointed a finger directly at my face. He started screaming that I had brainwashed his son, that I had spent the last 3 weeks whispering lies into Leo's ear to turn him against his own father. He accused me of being a jealous, childless woman who was trying to steal a kid because I couldn't have my own. The words were like physical blows. He said I was playing house with his property, and that I had no right to interfere in his family dynamics. He even brought up the money he had sent, claiming that I was a gold digger who was using Leo as a way to extort more cash from him, even though I hadn't spent a single cent of that money on myself. I told him that the only person destroying his family was the man staring back at him in the mirror, and that Leo's desire to stay had nothing to do with my influence and everything to do with the fact that for the first time in his life, he felt safe and seen. The argument moved to the front porch because I didn't want Leo to hear the worst of it, but Mark didn't care about volume. He was yelling so loud that Mrs. Gable from across the street came out to her porch to see what was happening. Mark kept shouting that I was a family wrecker, and that he was going to make sure I never saw Leo again. He told me that by encouraging Leo to speak up, I had broken the bond between a father and son, and that I would be responsible for the trauma Leo would face from here on out. It was a classic move, flipping the guilt onto me so he wouldn't have to carry the weight of his own neglect. He said that he had trusted me, his own sister, and that I had betrayed him in the most disgusting way possible by trying to replace him. Every time I tried to mention the dentist, the lack of food, or the emotional distance, he would shut me down, calling me a liar, and saying that I was overanalyzing normal parenting. The situation escalated when Chloe finally got out of the car. She didn't even look at Leo. She just looked at her watch and told Mark that they were going to be late for their reservation. That was the final straw for me. I told Mark that if he tried to force Leo into that car right now, while the boy was having a panic attack in the kitchen, I would call the police and report that he was intoxicated or unfit. It was a bluff mostly, but it worked to stall him. Mark stepped into my personal space, his breath smelling of stale coffee and something metallic, and told me that I had until Monday morning. He said he would be back with a lawyer if he had to, and that if Leo wasn't standing on the driveway with his bags packed, he would ruin my life and make sure I lost my job and my reputation. He called me a snake one last time before slamming his car door and peeling out of the driveway, leaving a cloud of exhaust and a broken family in his wake. I went back inside to find Leo curled in a ball on the kitchen floor, sobbing quietly, and as I picked him up, I knew that the next 48 hours would be the most difficult of my life. I wasn't just his aunt anymore. I was his only advocate, and the war for his future had officially begun. The 48 hours after Mark screamed at me on my porch were the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I just sat in the living room, watching the security camera feed on my phone, and waiting for his SUV to reappear. Every time a car drove past, Leo would jump and hide behind the sofa. It was heartbreaking to see a 7-year-old living like a fugitive in a suburban house. On Sunday night, while Leo was finally asleep, I did something I'm not proud of, but I was desperate. Mark had left his leather laptop bag in my hallway in his rush to leave on Saturday. I hadn't noticed it until I tripped over it in the dark. I knew I should just put it aside, but something in my gut told me that the stressed-out architect's story was a lie. I opened the bag, expecting to find blueprints or a work laptop. Instead, I found a stack of legal documents and a burner phone that kept buzzing with notifications from a contact labeled L. I started reading the papers and the room started spinning. These weren't work documents. They were court filings from the Cook County Circuit Court. It turned out that my brother hadn't just been left by his wife. Lisa hadn't abandoned Leo at all. She had filed for an emergency protection order against Mark 4 months ago. The document stated that Mark had a severe gambling addiction that had wiped out their entire savings, and the college fund our parents had set up for Leo. He hadn't been staying late at the office. He had been at an illegal poker room in South Chicago. But the real kicker, the thing that made my blood turn to ice, was the kidnapping allegation. Lisa had primary custody, and Mark was only supposed to have supervised visits. He had picked Leo up from school 3 weeks ago and vanished. He hadn't come to me because he was tired. He had come to me to hide the boy while he tried to figure out a way to get out of the country or settle his debts. I sat on the floor surrounded by these papers, realizing that I had spent the last 3 weeks unintentionally aiding and abetting a parental kidnapping. My own brother had used me as a human shield against the law and his ex-wife. He wasn't paying me salary money out of guilt. He was using the last of the stolen money to keep me quiet and happy so I wouldn't ask questions. And then there was the burner phone. I scrolled through the messages. Elle wasn't a girlfriend. It was a debt collector. The messages were graphic. They weren't asking for money anymore, they were making threats. One message from Friday said, "We know the kid is with your sister in the suburbs. If we don't get the 20 grand by Monday, we're coming to the house to collect it another way." My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would crack a rib. Mark wasn't coming back on Monday to take Leo to brunch. He was coming back because he was terrified that the people he owed money to were closing in on my house. He had put Leo and me in direct physical danger just to save his own skin. He had lied to our mother, lied to me, and was using his son as a bargaining chip. I looked at the Chloe woman in a new light. She probably wasn't a girlfriend at all, but someone he was using to look stable, if the police ever caught up to him. The moral dilemma hit me like a freight train. If I called the police right now, Mark was going to prison for a long time. He would lose his license, his house, and any chance of ever seeing his son again. Our mother would never forgive me. She would see it as me snitching on my own blood. But if I didn't call, I was keeping Leo in a cycle of fear and potentially putting both of us in the crosshairs of some very dangerous people. I looked at the burner phone again. There was a missed call from a number I recognized. It was Lisa's old cell phone. She had been trying to reach this phone for weeks. I picked up my own phone to call her, my thumb hovering over the dial button. when I heard a soft creak on the stairs. It was Leo. He was standing there in his pajamas, holding his Spider-Man backpack. He looked at the papers scattered all over the floor. Then he looked at me. He didn't look surprised. He just looked tired. He walked over, sat down next to me and said, "Is Mommy coming to get me now?" He knew. He had known the whole time that they weren't supposed to be here. He had been playing along because he was scared of what Mark would do if he didn't. I had 12 hours until Mark was supposed to show up. 12 hours to decide if I was going to be the sister who saved her brother from the consequences of his actions, or the aunt who saved a little boy from a lifetime of chaos. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, and no matter which way I jumped, someone I loved was going to get hurt. I reached out and took Leo's hand, and for the first time in my life, I felt like a stranger to my own family. I realized that the family wrecker label Mark had thrown at me wasn't a threat. It was an inevitability. To save Leo, I had to destroy the only brother I had. Just as I was about to make the call, the burner phone in my hand lit up with a new message. It was a photo. It was a picture of my front door taken from the street with a caption that said, "We're outside, Mark. Stop hiding behind your sister. Bring the kid and the money out, or we're coming in to get both." My blood ran cold. They weren't waiting for Monday. They were here now. The moment I saw that photo of my own front door on the burner phone, the world seemed to slow down into a series of cold, calculated movements. I didn't scream and I didn't panic because I realized that my brother had brought a literal death threat to my doorstep, and my priority shifted from saving my family to keeping this child alive. I grabbed Leo, who was still looking at me with those wide, haunted eyes, and I dragged him into the walk-in pantry in the kitchen, telling him to sit on the floor and not to make a single sound regardless of what he heard. I dialed 911 and kept my voice at a low, steady whisper as I explained to the operator that there were unidentified men outside my house threatening me, and that I was a victim of an ongoing domestic kidnapping situation involving my nephew. While I was on the phone, I heard the sound of a heavy engine roaring into the driveway. It was Mark's SUV, and I knew the collision of his lies and his debts was about to happen right on my front lawn. I peeked through the blinds of the living room and saw Mark jump out of his car, looking frantic, but he was immediately intercepted by two men who had stepped out of the shadows of my oak trees. There were no cinematic threats or dramatic pauses. It was just brutal, efficient violence as one of the men shoved Mark against the side of his car and started demanding the money while Mark kept pointing at my house, clearly telling them that whatever they wanted was inside. The police sirens began to wail in the distance just as Mark tried to bolt toward my front door, but the men weren't looking to play games, and the scene descended into a chaotic scramble of shouting and flashing lights. When the cruisers pulled onto my street, the two men fled into the woods behind my property, leaving Mark slumped against his front tire, bleeding from a cut on his forehead and looking utterly defeated. I didn't run out to help him. I stayed inside with the door locked until the officers knocked and identified themselves. And even then, I only opened the door enough to hand them the stack of legal papers and the burner phone I had found in Mark's bag. I watched from the porch as they handcuffed my brother, not for the gambling debts, but for the felony kidnapping warrant that had been active in Chicago for weeks. Mark didn't even look at me with regret. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, screaming that I was a traitor and that he would make sure I was dead to the family for what I had done. The next few hours were a blur of statements, social workers, and the eventual arrival of Lisa, who had driven 6 hours straight from Chicago after the police contacted her. When she walked into my living room, she didn't look like the crazy, unstable mother Mark had described to me. She looked like a woman who had been through a war and had finally found her way home. The reunion between her and Leo was the most painful and beautiful thing I have ever witnessed. He didn't say a word. He just buried his face in her coat and sobbed with a sound that felt like it was tearing my own heart out of my chest. Lisa thanked me, but there was a distance in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement that I was still the sister of the man who had stolen her son and put him in harm's way, and I knew that our relationship would likely never move past this polite, tragic gratitude. It has been exactly 1 month since Mark first called me, and my life is unrecognizable compared to 30 days ago. My brother is currently awaiting trial and is facing significant prison time, and our mother has officially blocked my number after leaving a series of voicemails calling me a Judas and accusing me of destroying her son's life for a selfish sense of justice. She refused to believe the evidence of the gambling or the kidnapping. choosing instead to believe the narrative that I had orchestrated the whole thing to spite Mark. I lost my brother, I lost my mother, and I lost the quiet, peaceful life I had built for myself in this suburb. My neighbors look at me differently now, and the silence in my house is no longer peaceful. It is heavy and suffocating, filled with the ghosts of the month I spent trying to be a mother to a boy who wasn't mine. I received a letter from Leo yesterday, or rather a drawing. It's a picture of my garden with the roses we planted together. And on the back, in his messy 7-year-old handwriting, it just says, "Thank you for the pizza, Sarah Mom." I keep that paper on my fridge, and it's the only thing that makes the wreckage of my family feel worth it. I did the right thing, but the right thing didn't come with a reward. It came with a bill that I'll be paying for the rest of my life. I learned that loyalty to your blood is a toxic concept when that blood is willing to let you bleed out to save itself. People on Reddit always ask if someone is the jerk in these situations. But there is no simple answer when the person you're betraying is the one who raised you. I'm a family wrecker, I suppose, but as I look at the empty room where Leo used to sleep, I realize that some families are built on such rotten foundations that the only kind thing you can do is tear them down and hope that the children can build something better from the ruins. I don't know if I'll ever speak to my brother again, and honestly, the thought of that silence doesn't scare me as much as the thought of what would have happened if I had stayed quiet.